Jane Austen. She is such a beloved author. And if you love romance and cuddling up with a book, Pride and Prejudice is amazing. So we're going to start. Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Things are different these days, but back then, that was one of the majority of things that people were really interested in. I would say, in my personal opinion. So, continuing. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, the truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is a let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long had just been there, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear, you must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfields is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mrs. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? That is the question back then. Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. Can you imagine if that was a large fortune these days? We'd be so lucky. What a fine things for our girls. How so can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. The plotting Mrs. Bennet. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, as you are as handsome as any of them. Mr. Bingley may like you, the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. Well, these days you can get it plucked, tucked, sucked, filled, lifted, so you don't have to worry about beauty at any age these days. Because surgeons can do magic with anyone. Continuing. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It is more than I engaged for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on the account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. You are over scrupulous, surely. I dare to say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls. She's really interested in getting those girls married. Though I must throw a good word for my little Lizzie. I guess Lizzie is just, like a chump change there. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I'm sure she is not half as so handsome as Jane, nor half as so good-humored as Lydia. But you're always given her the preference. When you have daughters, more than one gets the preference. They have none of them thus to recommend them, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls. but Lizzie has something more quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion for my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. That is a funny line, people. I have heard you mention them with consideration these last 25 years at least. That sounds like a true marriage. 25 years of someone talking about her poor nerves to her husband. Can we think of any other interesting conversations that don't vex your husband? Ah, you do not know what I suffer. But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 should come, since you will not visit them. Well, she's told him. Depend on it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Ooh, they're jabbing each other there. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 30 and 20 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting the news. That's lovely. The mother wanted her daughters to be married, not even wanting them to be a writer or a doctor or a pilot or a train conductor or a landscaper or an artist or an actress or a speaker or an inventor. Chapter 2. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go until the evening after the visit was paid. She had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie. We are not in any way to know what Mr. Bingley likes, said her mother resentfully, since we are not to visit. But you forget, Mamma, said Elizabeth, that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long promised to introduce him. I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She's a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her. No more have I, said Mr. Bennet, and I'm glad to find you do not depend on her serving you. Mrs. Bennet designed not to make any reply, but unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. Don't keep coughing so, Kitty. For heaven's sake, have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces. Kitty has no discretion on her coughs, said her father. She times them ill. I do not cough for my own instrument, replied Kitty fretfully. When is the next ball to be, Lizzie? Tomorrow fortnight. Aye, so it is, cried her mother, and Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself. Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend and introduce Mr. Bingley to her. Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible when I am not acquainted with him myself. How can you be so teasing? I honor your circumspection. A fortnight acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will. And after all, Mrs. Long and her daughters must stand their chance, and therefore she will think it an act of kindness if you decline the office. I will take it on myself. The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet said only, Nonsense, nonsense. What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation, cried he. Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection. I know and read great books and make extracts. Mary wished to say something sensible, but knew not how. While Mary is adjusting her ideas, he continued, Let us return to Mr. Bingley. I'm sick of Mr. Bingley, cried his wife. I'm sorry to hear that, but why did you not tell me that before? If I had known as much this morning, certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished, that of Mrs. Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though, when the first turmoil of joy was over, she began to declare that it is what she had expected all the while. "How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet! But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am, and it is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now." "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, and he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "I'd be fatigued, too." "What an excellent father you girls have," said she, when the door was shut. "I do not know how you will ever make him amends for his kindness, for me either, for that matter. At our time of life it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintances every day. But for your sakes we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I'm not afraid, for though I'm the youngest, I am the tallest." Well, I guess being tall is something back then. The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return to Mr. Bennet's visit, and determine when they should ask him to dinner. Chapter 3. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced questions, ingenious suspicions, and distant surmises. But he eluded the skill of all of them, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favorable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "and all the others were equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." In a few days Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library, and he had hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, but he only saw the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses. I wonder what they were cooking back then. But the courses she planned, we have to credit it to her housekeeping. When the answer arrived, which deferred it all, Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honor of their invitation. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could be in so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and she began to fear that he might always be flying about from one place to another. Well, Lady Lucas quieted her fears by starting the idea of him being gone to London only to get a large party for the ball, and reports soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were confronted the day before the ball by hearing that instead of 12 he brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin, and then the party entered the assembly room. It consisted of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and a gentleman-like, and he had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report was in the general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance of his having 10,000 a year. So we will continue with Chapter 4 on the next podcast.